here. Okay. Well, welcome to this IconS new scholarship showcase seminar. I'm very pleased to be joined by Mathew John, who's a professor of law at Jindal Global University. Mathew has recently written a terrific book, and I think a really important book, called India's Communal Constitution, Law, Religion, and the Making of a People. So Mathew, first of all, thanks very much for doing this. Could I start by asking you sort of what the main claims are that you advance in this book?
Yeah, thanks, Rehan. It's wonderful to be here. Looking forward to speaking to the ICON audience. Let me start by trying to pick up on the main claim of the book by resorting to the first words of the Indian Constitution: "We the people." Right? I mean, it's an evocative phrase that pulls together pretty much all of modern politics, and the book, in some sense, is an answer to that question. Who are the people that authorize the Indian Constitution? The standard and perhaps dominant answer to that question is that the people are a liberal community of citizens, right? So right down from Granville, Austin, all the big scholars coming all the way down to Gautam Bhatia. Of course, there's the big Bakshis and so on in between, but the Gautam Bhatias and Mother Khoslas of the world, all of them make that claim or defend that claim in some form, that the people are a liberal community, right? And that the Constitution is organized to secure a liberal politics for, a liberal constitutional politics for India. And what I'm trying to put on the table, while not denying that central claim, is that there are also other ways of imagining the people that are tied into constitutional design and practice. And what I'm calling the communal constitution is one such way of imagining the people. Now, what is the communal constitution? It's a way of thinking about the people as a community or a collection of communities, right? So that's roughly the broad central claim that the book is advancing. Why is this significant? It speaks to this current moment that we're in, the authoritarian moment, the moment that contracts pluralism, so on and so forth. There's the enormous threat of designing, of organizing a polity into us and them, friends and enemies, inside, outside, right? So that's the broad background against which this book is organized. And the central claim is that the Indian Constitution, alongside or juxtaposed with its liberal framing of the people, can also be framed in communal terms, as I outline in the book. That's a short summary of what the book is all about.
Great. Terrific. Just to pick up on that final point, and just for a kind of an international audience, I think much of the comparative constitutional literature nowadays very much sees Modi as part of an international trend in terms of the rise of populism, kind of illiberal authoritarian leader taking over a formerly liberal country, right? And sort of, should we say, altering the fundamental character of the country. And I think one of the things your book does, and I'm not sure how intentional this was, but one of the things your book does is to sort of gently push against that narrative and to say, yes, Modi is in some ways substantively different than leaders who have come before, but there's this long-standing thread of communalism in the Indian Constitution. And one way to think about the current moment is not simply that Modi is a break from the past, but that there's a slight reorienting of the focus. That is, we're moving away from liberalism perhaps as the dominant paradigm and seeing that communal thread being picked up and sort of taken in a different direction. And there's a rebalancing where that communal thread has sort of become more significant. Is that a fair summary of?
Yeah, that would be a reasonably fair summary of what, it would be one way of entering, the book, right? Though, of course, there's almost no mention of Modi, the BJP, and the RSS. That's by the by. What I'm trying to say is that there is a way of characterizing Indian constitutional politics in communal terms. And Modi is the Modi moment is an aggressive way of doing that. But perhaps more importantly, and this ties to, to why I wrote the book itself, right? It's there's an assault on pluralism in India, which maps on to what you're calling the authoritarian moment. There's all this abusive constitutionalism and so on and so forth. There's this entire sort of this huge literature that's developed around this theme. Perhaps the Indian way of entering that conversation would, and it's been there for some time in the social sciences. There are these scholars like Ashish Nandi and others who've spoken about it, but it is not so much a theme that has developed in law. Perhaps Ratna Kapoor in some way, in Secularism's Last Sigh, the old, it's a book from the early 90s, has also brought this up in some form. But what I'm trying to say is that structurally, there is a way of saying that this communal imagination of the people is encoded in our constitutional imagination. Right? And I think that's really, the provocation for the book, and also perhaps the book's contribution, right? And once again, it's extremely important, when one makes these sorts of statements in India, to be doubly clear that I'm not in any way endorsing the the Modi project. That's far from where I'm coming from. I'm just putting that out as a caveat to my Indian friends who will be listening to this conversation, right? So this concern for the assault on pluralism comes against something that you may have just heard of that's going on in India right now, the inauguration of the Ram temple at Ayodhya. Right? Now, that itself is in some senses is a mark of this eroding pluralism as I see it. Right? Now the thing is, all of us have, or many of us who've grown up in India, over the last, over the last many centuries, right? Or more. Ram is, to put it differently, Ram is a guiding ethical pole star, right? And had been for centuries. It doesn't matter whether you're Hindu or Christian or Muslim or whatever it is that you choose to identify yourself with, right? So in fact, the poet laureate of Pakistan, Muhammad Iqbal, calls Ram the Imam-e-Hind, right? He's in some sense the guiding light of all India. Right? And that's a Pakistani intellectual, pre-partition, of course. That's how he talks about it. But that pole star now has been anchored to a center, or at least there's a project to actively anchor that Ram to one center, right? And an excluding center. You divide the polity into us and them, friends and enemies and so on. And that temple in Ayodhya is a temple that's been built after having pushed one community out of that geographic space, right? And it's precisely a very modern kind of politics. It's not the politics it's not the ethical imagination that one would associate with Ram. And the law's participation in making this possible is what I think this book has tried to cast some light on.
Terrific. Can I just pick up something you said a little bit earlier about the constitutional imagination and communalism being part of that? In the book, you trace that imagination back to the colonial era. And I was wondering if you could give us just a couple of sort of examples of sort of aspects of modern Indian constitutionalism that actually have their roots in the colonial era and this kind of colonial imagining of who the Indian people are.
Right. So the way I've done it is by, like what I'm calling the communal constitution is actually the constituent vocabulary of the colonial state that carries over into the contemporary constitution. Right? It's a counterintuitive sort of way of characterizing Indian constitutionalism, because we would have thought that in 1950 we started anew, right? Clean slate and new beginning. So what I'm trying to say is that so in that introductory chapter, I try to trace out this communal constitution, and I say that it happens through three sort of processes or three axes. The axes of toleration, the axes of social reform, and the axes of communal representation in the political institutions of the colonial state. Right. So to start with, if one were to take toleration as a theme that developed in the colonial state, it's extremely interesting to look at the manner in which toleration developed as a way of regulating Indian religions, or India's traditions, really, religio-ethical traditions, as as I'd like to frame them, right? So toleration, as I've tried to frame it, was driven by probably Protestant themes, and it was trying to seek out the true foundations of India's religio-ethical traditions. And when a tradition was brought before it, it tried to ask that tradition, what is the true foundation on the basis of which this practice can be said to be religious, right? And there's the example that I use, quite liberally in the book, which is the example of sati. There was this colonial search for the true religious foundations of sati as a practice, right? And then, the search.
If you don't mind, just for non-Indian listeners, can you just tell us quickly what sati is?
Oh, yeah, sati is the practice of wife burning, which is associated with the Hindu community. And what I'm trying to say, is that it has come to be associated with the religious truths of the Hindu community in the form in which the colonial state associated with this practice, right? And so there was a search for its true foundations. The true foundations were found in certain religious texts, and those religious texts were said to underwrite a community, which is the community of Hindus, right? And practices which were not able to, which were not so identified, were understood to be non-religious practices, right? And so there was a way of finding the truth and producing a community, right? And now this is exactly what I'm saying takes place when the Indian Supreme Court searches for essential truths of, when the Supreme Court devises this mediating doctrine called the Essential Religious Practices Test. And from Jacqueline Neo's work, I understand that it's also extensively used in Southeast Asia as well as a mediating doctrine, right? Now, the form in which the essential practices produces the foundational truths of communities is, in some senses, a carryover of a colonial imagination of who the peoples of India are or were. Right? So that is the form in which that's the form in which I try to characterize the communal constitution, and that's a form in which I'm suggesting it carries over from the colonial state where it developed into the contemporary Indian constitutional imagination.
Terrific. You make a similar sort of argument about caste, in that you note that sort of one of the things that happened, and it seems in your account, and I found it quite convincing, it's sort of historically contingent, but that caste has been seen as a Hindu problem, as opposed to a kind of broader problem affecting India, say, or the subcontinent. And then that has kind of repercussions down the line for how we think of caste and how the sort of legal framework around caste has come up. Could you say a little bit about that? First, the kind of colonial imagination of caste and how that's sort of carried through.
Right. I mean, again, these are all very, very large areas, and my own understanding of it is as a legal scholar who's interested in this issue. It has its own limitations, but let me give it a stab. So the way in which I've framed it in the book is that caste is that the colonial state was centrally concerned with the problem of caste, right? And drawing on the work of Mark Galanter, I suggest that there were at least three sort of ways in which the colonial state had engaged with the problem of caste. Right? It engaged with the problem of caste, in what I call sacral terms. So that is what very closely maps onto what we're calling the Hindu conception of caste. So you search for caste by looking to Hindu classical doctrine, like the Hindu classical texts, and whether these classical texts, actually map onto one community again is an open question. But it has been understood to map onto what has come to be called the Hindu community in India today, right? Then you think of caste in terms of in sectarian terms, right? Where again there's some religiosity to caste, as Galanter puts it, but it is dealing with a specific community and its relationships with itself and with others. And then you think of caste in purely associational terms, where caste is understood to be, is understood to be religion neutral, and it's just the forms, just the form in which a particular group of people are pulled together, roughly. Right? Once again, what I'm trying to suggest in the book is that through this presidential order, which identifies scheduled castes who are entitled to who are first considered to be the most deprived sections of Indian people, and who were then entitled to certain affirmative action provisions under the Indian Constitution. Those groups of people were understood to be exclusively Hindu in the sacral frame, as I've just outlined it. Right? So there's a colonial conception of caste, and independent India, insofar as it deals with the problem of scheduled castes, and I also extended to the other backward castes as well. Both of them draw on this sacral imagination of caste, which is caste understood as a phenomenon grounded in the religio legal traditions of Dharma Shastra or of classical Hindu legal imagination, right? And that's the form in which I try to make the same connection. Right now, and here perhaps you're also seeing some kind of methodological orientation of the book itself, right? So there's a there's a characterization of a problem, which is that there is some kind of communal imagination of the Constitution. I locate that in the colonial state, and then I trace its spillover into the contemporary Constitution. And the form in which we have inherited this colonial imagination of who we are as a community, right? So who the people are, right? And that then is also extended into the discussions on personal law as well as minority rights, right? So that's that then covers the arc of the book as a whole.
Terrific, Matthew. Thank you. You've preempted my question about methodology. That's terrific. Can I ask, in terms of just kind of related to that, I mean, so in writing this, right, obviously there's a legal aspect to it. There's this historical aspect. There's also a sort of anthropological part that's maybe a little bit in the background. Who did you have in mind as the potential audience for this book? Is it Indian constitutional scholars, broader public, other folks? What did you have in mind, and what were you thinking of sort of as the book's potential impact? As you wrote it?
So the book is trying to grapple with a problem, right? And the problem, I would say, is located in the field of constitution studies of South Asia, right? So anyone with an interest in constitution studies in South Asia is a possible or potential person I would like to speak to, right? But at the same time, it's also speaking to various and if I were to break that down, it would be lawyers and academics, most certainly, but also historians, political scientists, political theorists, anthropologists, sociologists. So there's a wide audience, but people who have an interest in South Asian constitutionalism. And to the extent to which I'm talking about the migration of ideas into India, European ideas into India, perhaps constitutional scholars elsewhere too would have an interest in this book.
Terrific. And in terms of sort of where you think it fits, can you sort of maybe place it within sort of existing scholarship? Because it's an interesting book in the sense that it's, on the one hand, a treatment of quite a specific set of constitutional issues, but on the other hand is, a kind of broader theoretical project about sort of how Indian people conceive of themselves and how the Indian Constitution conceives of them. Can you fit that within sort of the existing literature? Is this building on kind of a past tradition of work, or do you see it as kind of nestled between different literatures? I'm curious to see how you sort of conceive of the book in that sense.
So I was thinking about this question, again, like as I was writing the book as well. There is one body of scholarship, it's not so much that I'm pushing against it, but, I suppose I'm juxtaposed to that, to that body of scholarship. And that is, the scholarship of people, the most recent exponents of that body of scholarship would be people like would be people like Gautam Bhatia or Madhav Khosla, right? So the scholars, but again, as I said, there's a long lineage of this scholarship. The scholars who say that we have a liberal constitution.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to, and I'm not at all denying that claim, because I do think that the overwhelming structure of the Indian Constitution is organized in broadly liberal terms. But my work is perhaps a qualification to that kind of claim. That in addition to that, we do need to take seriously these communal aspects of our constitutional horizons and imaginations. Right? So that's one body of scholarship against which my book is situated. So it's mildly breaking away from that that way of characterizing our constitution. The rest of the book should be seen as as stitching together various other kinds of various other kinds of scholarships, various other tropes of scholarship. Right? So there would be what I would call post-colonial scholarship. Right? So the people I have in mind here would be Partho Chatterjee, who features quite extensively in the book. So it would be Partho Chatterjee, Ashish Nandi, Sudipto Kaviraj, Lata Mani. There are a range of scholars of that ilk whose work has influenced the way in which the book has been put together. There's also constitutional historians, right? And especially colonial constitutional historians. So there's work. There's A.B. Keith to some degree. There's Reginald Copeland. There are all of these colonial reports that I draw on. There's also Desi Kachar. Now these are less known, less known scholars. So for a global audience, these are people. A.B. Keith perhaps is a Scottish historian, so maybe, and Reginald Copeland again, colonial historian. So maybe global Western audiences may be interested to look at the lineage of those ideas in India. I mean, the form in which their ideas have influenced Indian constitutionalism. So those would be three. And of course, it's not so much scholarship, but the work of the Indian Supreme Court as well, which is also a resource that I draw on to elaborate the communal constitution as I have framed it. And I forget, there's some revisionist constitution. I mean, there's revisionist work as well by less known scholars like, there's S.N. Balagangadhara, Vivek Dareshwar, whose work is cited, perhaps Akhil Bilgrami as well, whose work is cited in the book. But I use them to develop, for instance, this idea of toleration in the colonial state. Right? So those would be some of the lines of scholarship that pull the book together.
Terrific. Can I just ask a quick follow-up about the Supreme Court? Because we've had a kind of broad-ranging discussion. I want to just be a bit more kind of law-centric for a second. So I think one of the things your book does very well is to give a little bit of an, I don't want to call it it is sort of a sociological account, but also a historical account of certain Indian Supreme Court justices who I think are less well-known outside of India, but who were very influential in the development of some of these doctrines, including this essential practices doctrine in the 1950s and 60s. Chief among them is Chief Justice Gajendra Gadkar, who you talk about at length. Could you say a little bit about that era of the Indian Supreme Court, especially as it relates to religion and the kind of sort of reformist tendencies that they had, and sort of kind of how that sort of then maybe plays into how the Supreme Court developed?
Sure. Again, this is something that I must confess that I don't know this era well enough to make any authoritative claims about it. But to the extent that I do, there was there was this modernizing promise. The modernizing promise, in some sense, was embodied in the Constitution itself, in the in the provisions of the Constitution, where the Constitution in Article 25(2) allows the state to intervene in religion to socially reform religion. Right? That promise gives the state significant powers to what's the right word, to intervene in the in matters of religion. Right? This constitutional imagination reaches its intellectual high point in the 1960s in the work of P.B. Gajendra Gadkar. Right? Now, P.B. Gajendra Gadkar, as I understand it, is a Sanskrit scholar. he's a Marathi Brahmin Sanskrit scholar. And he, if this case that I cite, the Dargah committee case, but there are other cases as well that he has adjudicated. There's also the Swaminarayan case, and so many of these cases, he significantly expands state power to say that the state is almost the absolute arbiter of the extent to which it can imagine and shape the contours of a religious tradition, right? And it's so much to the extent, so much so that he says that the state also has a power to separate out what is superstitious and what is actually true in a religious tradition. Right? Now, that's a staggering kind of claim to make about the nature of a religious tradition, especially to someone from coming from a Western political legal imagination, right? So that is what the modernist promise of the Constitution and a judge like Gajendra Gadkar has meant. Right? That's where I'll have to leave it, because my historical understanding of Gajendra Gadkar in particular, or of that period as a whole, goes only so far, right? So I have an understanding that there was this grand modernist promise of reorganizing Hinduism, especially its more regressive practices, and to clean it out, of all of its various regressive ethical forms, right? And this is how the Indian Constitution entered Hinduism and produced this cleaned out Hinduism, that Gajendra Gadkar seemingly wanted to do, right? So this was the ambition, and it is reflected in this case that I discuss in the book.
Terrific. And just again, for non-Indian listeners, I mean, this doctrine continues today. So recent well-known case, Sabarimala, where the Supreme Court decided that, a temple in Kerala, the court decided that it was unconstitutional for a temple in Kerala to exclude menstruating women on the grounds that, that wasn't an essential part of their religious belief, right? Which again kind of gives the court this unbelievable power, as you say, to determine what is and what is not a legitimate part of religion, which is quite a striking claim. Terrific. Can we move to talk a little bit, Mathew, just about your process? So maybe tell us a little bit about kind of the challenges of writing this book, also maybe what you found rewarding about writing the book.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very, very difficult book to write. Well, primarily because it's I'm trained in law, but the book does, as you'll see, does not have a lawyer's imagination, right? It's a book that comes from well beyond the autonomous domains of law, as it were, right? So to draw on these other disciplines, history, politics, anthropology to some extent, and produce this hypothesis that I'm calling the colonial constitution, was perhaps the most difficult part of the book. To crystallize this hypothesis as something that could hold and something that I could evidence, right? Something that I could demonstrate. And so, it was both the pain and the pleasure, right? So it took a long time coming. This is a book that that actually is an extension of my PhD thesis itself, right?
Oh, wow.
And I don't think so the PhD thesis, I don't think the PhD thesis was clear enough in terms of articulating what I was trying to get at. I finally managed to put it together. It's still a very, very short book, and so it's a short restatement of what of what I was trying to do in my PhD, and I'm glad it's come together, and I'm glad it's over in some sense, right? So what I was trying to do in the PhD was to speak of secularism, and once again I was trying to do it from a non-normative point of view, right? I was trying to think of secularism as a form of disciplining Indian society, right? So you again, you're trying to produce these identities, Hindu, Muslim, and so on and so forth, right? What is the sociological impact of secularism, ethnographic sociological impact of secularism as it plays out in India was the question I was asking there. And I think I've crystallized it, in this book to say that, secularism, if one were to push it back historically, has this slightly communal dimension, right?
Mm.
Or at least it's one of the various histories that one can draw if one were to go back, on ushering in a secular trajectory for modern India.
So these are ideas that have been percolating for a long time and then have kind of crystallized in the book.
Yeah. And so again, as I was saying, so it is what gave me a lot of joy, that it's finally come together. But at the same time, it was a long time. It was a long time coming, and so it was also quite painful.
Do you have advice for, we hopefully have early career scholars listening to this. Do you have any advice for first-time book authors or people trying to convert their PhDs into a book?
Well, not quite. In the sense that, the one thing about scholarly activity is that it's extremely lonely. So if there's any advice, make sure that you have a set of good friends, with whom you can bounce these ideas off. But beyond that, not really. Yeah, actually, no, I'll just leave it at that.
Fine. I think that's actually very good advice. And just finally, Mathew, what are you working on now? Are you taking a break? Is there another kind of I don't know, long-running project that you're going to turn to now? What's next for you?
Well, at one level, yes, I am taking a break. I'm I'm glad that this thing is over, and it has given me some breathing room. But the one thing that I am thinking of continuing working on from this project is again something that is not very clearly articulated yet in my head, but it's also there in the book, actually, in the concluding chapter, which is to think about pluralism as a way of pulling together as a way of pulling together India as a people, right? Now, as I said in the last paragraph, perhaps pluralism's biggest advocate is Mohandas Gandhi, and the way in which he did it is quite interesting, I think, which is to deny the very idea of the people. He said that it's just plural practice that makes India what it is, right? So when we think of the people, we think of the people as like some kind of sovereign actor, right? The sovereign people authorize the constitution, and I think there's something in Gandhi that was trying to, that recoiled against that, and he was trying to think about the people from the point of pluralism, plain and simple, or perhaps pluralism, understood in a very complicated way, right? What that is the question that, I think is worth exploring and pushing further. Again, a question that would involve a little bit of law, a little bit of, perhaps political theory, and perhaps the work would get a little more normative than it has in this book. So that's where I think
No, it's terrific. India's plural constitution, the sequel to communal constitution.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
Mathew, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the chat.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing
this. Thank you. Thank you, Rehan. Wonderful talking.